So, Cliff, talk to me about your SAG service.
Oh, well, it's pulling a long bow, going way back to the 50s, late 50s. I was asked to be a member of the council in California, and um, I ventured into that firmament where angels fear to tread, not knowing much about the union except that I knew it was a good union, it was an honest union, and it was my union because I was a member then. Not hadn't been a member too long. This is the very late 50s. And so I served on the council. And then about, gosh, almost 20 years ago, I guess, they asked me here in New York. I've been living in New York for many, many years to be on the board, the New York board in which I have served, and I have enjoyed it. And I've tried to pull my oar, along with a lot of very good oarsmen and women who are in the New York branch. I'm proud to be on the same craft.
Well, um, there is, you did a very moving thing where you had a plea to other stars, other actors of stature to participate. Can you um, do a direct address on this one for us? I think it's a very important issue that.
Well, it's a bit of irony that our union was started in the 30s, in the mid 30s, and it was the leaders of that very dangerous move because there were goon squads and bullies. Some of the big studio heads and these guys were pretty tough characters, and they were being very unfair to the actor. And the actors, led, I might add, by some of the biggest names and biggest stars, formed a union. They even had to meet covertly. They would park their cars 6 blocks away from another member's house. They'd meet at night for fear of bodily injury because there was all kinds of threats. So in the 30s, our union was formed by these brave men and women. And the irony is today, all these years later, with all the wonderful developments in our union and in our industry, the irony is that there seems to be a reverse trend. Seems to be, there is. There's the high-profile actors seem to be reluctant to. I mean, they pay their union dues and they're grateful, I'm sure, for all the good things the union has afforded them. But they haven't. Very few of them have volunteered to come out of their moneyed cocoons, their Mediterranean manses up on the tops of the hills. They're sitting up there enjoying all the fruits of their craft, and they certainly deserve it, I'm sure, in most cases. And they are also, they're being afforded all these good things as a direct result of what our union has done for them. This is not in any way to dismiss their talents, but it's to decry this lack of concern, almost cavalier attitude about the union. Well, I pay my dues. What the hell? I mean, that's all that's necessary, right? Well, it wasn't too long ago before some of those same people were saying, once I get into the union, I've got a leg up. Then by gum, I'll make my career. And of course, once they got into the union, they ultimately did make their career, but how soon they forget. And I decry this, and have for some years every time we come up for re-election. That's sort of been one of my mantras, I suppose you'd say. Where are our big name people? We are always referring to the big stars as the engine that drives the train, but if the engine's sitting in the roundhouse somewhere idly, who's going to drive the train aside from the body membership? And they do, and with our wonderful board members, not only in California and New York, but Washington, D.C., and Florida, and Detroit, and Dallas, and these other places where the membership are working daily to help their fellow members. And that's what it's all about, helping your fellow actor. There's a thing called rap that we've all heard about, and we identify rap as sort of angry young youth of the inner cities. But in truth, rap has been around since before, in the BC days, in Greek times. There were always men and women who were saying things to a rhythm, and some they were Greek chorus or whatever. So it's nothing new throughout, and in the religious plays. Throughout civilization time, there's been a kind of a rap. So I wrote this rap, and I apologize for it ahead of time. As I say, it's not deathless prose, and I'm not a rap star or a rock star, but it's about this reluctance of some of the big stars who not just come to a meeting now and then, although that would be helpful, but or not just pay your dues, and that's nice, but to actually get involved, because you, the big name people, have a very resounding voice. When you speak out, people listen. It's not that the body membership isn't listened to, it's just that you individuals have a very clarion voice if you pronounce it in the right places. Now, we see some of our big, and I've been one, who go to Washington for various causes, and we applaud that. But it would be nice if they would kind of get involved in the unions. Anyway, this is called Hey, Mr. Movie Star. Hey, Mr. Movie Star, up in the sky so far, up in them hills so far, don't you hear us down below? Crying up to you to go to a meeting now and then? Ain't no problem. Ain't no sin. Ain't no sin, Mr. Movie Star, to listen to what we gotta say. Take no time from your day. Cost no money from your pay. Cost no nothing for you to say, yeah, hey, I could go, yeah, hey, I want to go. So what you say? Say what? Say you got a meeting? So you want to sweeten that picture deal? That deal worth millions? Say what, my man? Do what you can. But first you gotta ask star members of the cast what they would do. 'Tis true. You say they, like you, ain't got the time. Not now, that is. That's fine, that's fine. But soon, you say, real soon you'll be coming down that rich man's path to condescend and autograph, to slap our backs, to fix your smile and your inimitable style. Yeah, that movie style. Real soon, you say, real soon. But first, we got to understand there's nothing you'd like better than to be with us other actors, but damn, there's other factors. You know, like what? We ask. What other things? We've touched a nerve. Our question stings. His answer swerves to other things. Big deals, big wheels, big other things. Our memory flashes back to yesteryear when Mr. Movie Star was in fear. He'd never get in the union, never get the chance to follow the path of stardom, the path of fame, the chance for monetary gain. The union, he'd cry. It will pave the way. It will answer all my dreams. Once I'm in, I'm bound to win. And then you're in. You're in, Mr. Movie Star. You're in the union. You're in. But that was yesterday, you say. Years ago, I've filled my cup, you say. I've paid my dues. I'm free to do what I damn choose. Hey, Mr. Movie Star. Up in the sky so far. up in them hills so far. Don't you hear us down below? Open up your electric gate. Come on down. Participate. Don't you hear us down below? Crying up to you to go to a meeting now and then. Ain't no problem. Ain't no sin. Ain't no sin, Mr. Movie Star, to listen what we got to say. Take no time from your day. Cost no dollar from your pay. Don't cost nothing for you to say, yeah, hey, I could go. Hey, I might go. Hey, I will go. I will go. Next year.
That's great. Yeah, talk to me about the travel you do on behalf of SAG.
Well, that's it, basically. Aside from going to the meetings in New York, I live out 2.5 hours out in the country, so I take the jitney in here for board meetings in New York, and then we go out to the California meetings on occasion. Try to do as many of those as our work permits.
But you had spoken before, actually, you had said something to the effect, we must remember to listen to each other and be ready to pull together. I think, you're a real source of inspiration when you travel around to the branches. So,
I don't know if I'm a source of inspiration. I would question that. I'm a source of maybe appreciation that I've survived. I mean, surviving in this crazy craft is in itself sometimes an act of courage, certainly of humility, because it's a tough business we're in. I even hate to use the word business. It's a craft, it's an art, hopefully, recreative, if not creative. So some of us have had some rough patches in our professional lives. Most of us have. And I've had my share, and I think the fact that I've survived them is a testament to not only some obdurate gene that's misplaced somewhere along the line in my makeup, but maybe the fact that I've been in the trenches long enough to build up a few calluses. So if you've had a few kicks, you build up calluses. If you build up calluses, you can take a few more kicks.
what is special about this guild? You spoke about its huge heart that it needs pumping. Talk to me about some of the special qualities you.
Well, the qualities of the union are not unlike the qualities in the craft. There's a sensibility, a sensitivity, a recreative, and a creative dynamic. So when you go to a Screen Actors Guild meetings, when you go to our meetings, whether they're board meetings or general members, there is you sense they're articulate. They're not all Shakespearean actors, but they are articulate in their ability, maybe it's just through their passion, to be understood. They may agree or disagree in a situation. You have all kinds of points of views, and we have some heated, lively board meetings as well as generalship meetings, and that's what we encourage. We don't encourage confrontation for confrontation's sake. We encourage confrontation if it is an echo of our feelings and our honest feelings. And this is this open discourse. So it's democracy in action. And I think the Screen Actors Guild as a union are an articulate guild, impassioned, energetic, bright, and there's a communion there too, because most of us have been down a rough patch. Most of the people in our craft have not had it too easy. I mean, we've got those very fortunate people who just had it easy all the way, but they're in a big minority. I'm an adjunct professor at my college, and I talk to these would-be writer, director, actors. I started as a journalist, and I still write. And I talk to these would-be writer, director, actors, and I try to explain to them the hard statistics that in a union of some 80,000 members, all of whom are professional, ergo experienced, hopefully talented, there has always been a high poverty rate as far as their salary. So many of our members have to augment their salary with other jobs. Now, that's not so bad when you're 19, 20, or in your 20s. As you get older, that's a little tough. And you want to make sure the people who are thinking of coming into our I hate that business term, but it's a business, but who are thinking of coming into showbiz, you want them to know up front that the odds are tough. I don't think there's, with the possible exception of poets, I don't think there's any profession that has more pitfalls, dangerous bogs. It's a rough road. And why are we in it? Because we love it. And that's another thing that makes our union unique. Not many unions are compiled of people who love the work. An awful lot of unions consist of people who are in that union because that's the only job they can get, or it's the only one they've fallen into over the years. But ours, it's because we're all dreamers and we're following that dream. Sometimes it's a nightmare. But we hang in. So if you've been down those rough patches and you've been in those trenches, you feel an obligation, at least I do, to talk to these young people to let them know ahead of time. I always tell them, if it's the Eastern school I went to, and when I talk to them, I say, if you insist on going out to La La Land, to Hollywood, if you're an actor, I recommend them trying out in the theater first. I think it was my background, and it's a good background. But I always tell them, if you insist on going out to Hollywood, take a round-trip ticket for two reasons. One, to get back if you need to and you want to. But more importantly, remember who you were when you went out. Don't fall into the muds of Malibu. Nothing against Malibu. God made a beautiful beach. But when I say that, I mean don't fall into that environment of excess luxury, or, God forbid, drugs, or looking for the easy way. There ain't no easy way, Virginia. Some people are lucky, and some of those lucky people are highly publicized and spend a lot of money reminding other people how highly publicized they are, or how tall they are in the business. But the truth of it is, most of us are all down below. But as Oscar Wilde said, we may be standing in the mud, but we're at least looking up. Well, as I said earlier, it's always referred to the stars of the engine of the train, but it doesn't mean anything if it's sitting there in the roundhouse, just idly letting go steam but not pulling anything. And we can accomplish as much as we have accomplished. We've accomplished a lot of it because of the star power, particularly in those earlier days that I mentioned, when the stars were the true leaders of our union. And now, with the absence of so many of them, and that's poses a question. It's not an easy question, and I'm sure there are lots of answers. But why? I mean, the person who doesn't know anything about it would ask that question, why is that? Is it because they just have short memories? Or is it because they don't think of the union as anything other than something that they can ride off of? Is it a fear? And I have written, and as a matter of fact, I wrote a thing in the New York Times I wrote some years ago, which I delivered at a board meeting. No, a general memory here in New York. And when I did it, everybody said, "Cliff, do you think you'll suffer from this?" And I said, "I don't know." Well, it had to do with my exposure of corruption on a corporate level. Specifically, the then president of Columbia Pictures, a man named David Beagleman, had forged my name. And we discovered it. It turned out that he'd forged others and he'd done a lot of very bad things. And I confronted that. And as a result of that, we opened up what was subsequently referred to as Hollywood Gate. And when I did that, everybody said, "Attenzione, this may bounce back on you," because there's certain people within the industry. We're not talking about actors now. We're not talking about you and you. We're talking about a few, just a cabal, who felt threatened by what I had done. And as it was explained to me by the FBI subsequently and other law authorities, this small, tiny group of greedy characters were not concerned about Cliff Robertson, couldn't care less that I had exposed this. What they were concerned about was that what I had done was, up to that time, unprecedented. I had confronted corporate corruption on a high, high level. And they, the small group of, and we're not talking about studios, we're just talking about a small, I won't go into their names, it's not important. But they were concerned that their 70-year honeymoon had come to an end because the unwritten commandment in Hollywood for 70-odd years had always been, "Thou shalt never confront a major mogul in Hollywood on corruption, no matter how much of it is there. Thou shalt never confront a major mogul on corruption, or thou shalt not work." And I had done that. I did not consider myself Don Quixote with or without portfolio. When we found this, we discovered this, we recognized that this was a felony, and I would have been an accessory to a very high crime had I not done what I did, which was simply give it to the authorities for them to do with it what they deemed should be done, and they subsequently did. So what we did was just obey the law. We were not prosecuting or persecuting anybody. But we were not running away from anybody, in spite of some not always so veiled threats that I would get phone calls in the middle of the night and things like, "You want to keep working," stuff like that. So we found ourselves in this rather Byzantine drama. And I kept thinking, this isn't me. I don't even live out there in Hollywood. I can't believe this is happening to me. But it was happening, and I didn't work in film for about over 3 years. I directed a little small movie, and I wrote a play, and I lectured a bit about corporate corruption, and as well as talked at some colleges. But basically, I didn't work for those 3.5 years, and it was explained to me by the FBI. They said, these guys want to send a message to other, not only actors, but writers, directors, even producers. Take a page out of Cliff's notebook and do not pull a Cliff Robertson, or you too will find you're not working. And that's basically what happened. But then I got a job. Doug Trumbull hired me on a picture called Brainstorm, which turned out to be poor Natalie Wood's last movie. But once I was hired in that picture, the phone started ringing again. The phone had rung before that, my agent explained to me, but he said for 3 years the dialogue was something like, "Is Cliff available for such and such a film?" And my agent would say, all things being equitable, of course. And the director would say, "I'll get back to you." And then they'd get back, and the general tone was, "Sorry, it's just not going to work out." Which meant they'd gone to their producers, or producer, and the producer had said, "Look, we would like to have Cliff Robertson in this movie, but we don't want to inherit his problems right now. There's some heavy hitters here that are trying to send a message down to all the people in our firmament. Don't do the unconscionable in their minds. In other words, don't confront corruption, particularly on a high level, or you will not work. So we broke that, and it broke us. And I might say I was very, I've won other awards, and I'm proud of all of them, Oscars and Emmys and all that stuff. But I am just as proud of the commendation I got from my union, Screen Actors Guild, for standing up to corporate corruption at such a level. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm proud of my union. I'm proud of what happened. I continually send a little word up to the dear Lord, please don't test me again. But if it happens, it happens. The main thing is to stand fast, hang in there. It's easy to say don't be afraid, but when your salary or your compensation for your work is not coming in and your responsibilities are not leaving, it's pretty tough. And it's easy for some of us who have been more lucky or luckier than others to say hang in there and not be afraid. But an awful lot of people say, well, that's fine if you've got a little bit of reserve in the bank. So I don't like to crow too much about that. But I guess philosophically, what I was trying to say was that the strength of a democracy, obviously, and the strength of a union, and yes, the strength of an industry, the core strength is its ability to look at itself honestly, wart and all, as Oliver Cromwell said. Look at its warts as well as its virtues. Recognize them, confront them, try to excise them. Look at yourself honestly as a union, as an artist, as a worker, as an American. And don't be afraid to look at yourself, because that's the strength of a democracy. That's the strength of a union, that's the strength of an industry. And I think that's one of the strengths of an individual, the ability to look at yourself. Clear-eyed, honestly, wart and all, recognize it, and try to excise it.
Tell me the story of Hollywoodgate.
Oh boy. Well, in the etymology of America, we have this gate thing, which essentially means scandal. It started with Watergate. Subsequently, we've had Wall Street Gate, Iran Gate, Hollywood Gate. And there'll be a lot of gates, sadly, in the future. But Hollywood Gate refers to a situation in which I happen to inadvertently play a rather large role, not the kind of role you seek, inadvertent. I mean, it was just serendipitous. But I think the dear Lord above, somewhere or other, there's a plan. I have a feeling that these things don't happen accidentally. All right, I'm not going to bore you with too much of it, but I'll try to give you a kind of an overview.
Not an overview, Cliff.
All right. Oh, dear.
How did it start?
It started with a question. I was out in California doing Washington Behind Closed Doors, which was a 6 or 7 parts television thing all about, ironically, Watergate, with different names. Jason Robards, my old pal, was out. He was playing one of the roles, and I was playing one of the roles. And I rented a house, as I want to do, and I took my daughter and my wife at the time, and my daughter was in about 7, I guess. And on a Saturday, my secretary, Evelyn Crystal, with whom I've worked for over 30 years now, she lives out there. So whenever I'm out there, and when I'm not out there, she does work for me. I've never had a press agent, so it's not that kind of work. It's just secretarial work. On a Saturday, she came over to the house with a bundle of bills, and like all of us, I started kind of digging into these things and signing checks and trying to pay my bills. And I came across a 1099 IRS form. 1099, which I knew nothing about then, is miscellaneous income. Well, I'd never had occasion to receive miscellaneous income, so I didn't know what it was all about. But essentially, it was saying that I owed taxes to the United States government, to the IRS, for monies received from Columbia Pictures under a 1099 miscellaneous income clause. Well, the irony is it was for $10,000. It's not what I get for a movie. And I hadn't even worked for Columbia that preceding year. So I said to Evelyn Crystal, my secretary, I said, what is this all about? She said, I have no idea. I said, well, they're indicating I owe taxes on this, and I'm not about to pay my hard-earned money in taxes on money I didn't receive. Obviously, a computer's made a mistake. And that's what I thought, quite honestly. And so I said to Evelyn, please investigate and let me know. Well, she tried. Many phone calls to Columbia Pictures. Each one came to a dead end, and she was always referred to somebody else. Somebody else passed to somebody else. And after months, it was obvious that something was there was something in Denmark that was not quite correct. So I then said to my accountant, Mr. Kahaner, who'd been with me, a former member of the IRS, by the way, a man of unimpeachable integrity, I said, Mr. Kahaner, would you look into this? Because Evelyn can't get anywhere. If she calls Columbia, she never can get anywhere. So he said he would. Now, I had done Charly and had gotten a lot of attention, won Academy Award and all those things, nice things. And I had also been an honorary chairman of mental health as a result of that. And so they, at one point, got a call from New Zealand, the mental health program in New Zealand, who subsequently called me and asked if I would come to New Zealand for a couple of weeks and help them raise money for their mental health program. I said I happened to be free at the time, and it was a vacation time for around Easter. I said, can I bring my 8-year-old daughter, Heather? They said yes. So Heather and I got in a plane, went to Los Angeles, got to LAX, and I called Evelyn, as I always do when I get there, because I had about a 40-hour period before I had to catch a plane to New Zealand. I called Evelyn. She said, call Mr. Kahaner immediately. It's very important. So I call Mr. Kahaner. Buddy, I call him. And I said, Buddy, what's the situation? He said, I want you to come over here immediately. I said, well, it's been a 5-hour flight. Heather is a little tired. I'm a little weary. Can we do this tomorrow? He said, no, it's urgent now. So Heather and I went schlepping over to his office. And he called me in. Heather stayed out in the other office with one of the secretaries. And I said, what is it, buddy? And he said, I know that Evelyn couldn't get anywhere with her calls at Columbia, but I finally contacted the bank where a check was cashed. And it was a check payable to you. I said, really? How'd you do that? He said, I talked to somebody, and he made a lot of calls, and he finally found somebody at the Beverly Hills Wells Fargo Bank. And he said, a very nice woman, and I never could remember her name. It was either Fitzpatrick or Fitzsimmons, something like that. And he said, she was very nice, very forthcoming, but she said the bank rules indicate that we can only give all information that's wanted to the individual concerned, which is Mr. Robertson. He had just gotten his phone call. So I said, well, what does this check look like? He reached into his drawer. He'd just gotten a Xerox copy. Passed it across the desk. And I looked at it. It was a Xerox copy of Bank of America, which was the bank that Columbia Pictures used in Hollywood. Payable to Cliff Robertson, $10,000. Two officers' names on the front, one a woman. Didn't say what it was for. And he said, look in the back. And in the back, in a florid signature, and not mine, said Cliff Robertson. And underneath that was a little stamp. Underneath the stamp was a little JL. And I said, buddy, what does this mean? He said, it means that your name was forged. And it means that this check for $10,000 was cashed, not at the Bank of America Hollywood and Vine branch where Columbia was doing business, but in their Beverly Hills Bank of Wells Fargo. And I said, well, what is JL? He said, well, that's the officer there in that Beverly Hills Bank in charge of the entertainment division, Mr. Lipsher, Joe Lipsher. And I said, well, what does Mr. Lipsher say? And he said, well, I haven't been able to reach him. But he said, I did talk to this Miss Fitzpatrick or Fitzsimmons, and she said when Mr. Robertson comes in, have him call me. So I said, let's call her. He had two phones. He picked up one, I picked the other. Miss Fitzsimmons, Fitzgibbons, this is Mr. Kahaner. I'm here with my client, Cliff Robertson. Could you give us all the other information? Very straightforward, very obviously very honest type of person. She gave us the basic. When was it brought in, Miss Fitzsimmons? Oh, she gave the date. When it was brought in, it was okayed. Yes, by whom? Oh, by our officer in charge of entertainment, Mr. Lipsher. I see. It was okay by him, yes. It was processed, yes. By whom? By me. Oh, it was processed by you. Cash? No. American Express traveler's checks. Oh, and to whom were the traveler's checks made out to? Well, the president of Columbia Pictures, David Beagleman. Thank you. He hung up. I hung up. And he looked at me, and I remember to my dying day, he said, Cliff, you're sitting on a hydrogen bomb. And I remember after a pause, the first thing I said was, buddy, I wish it were you instead of me. You have to understand a couple things at that time. David Beagleman had been made rather swiftly and even mysteriously president of Columbia Pictures, not too long before. And when I say swiftly and mysteriously, he had never been a producer, certainly wasn't a writer, wasn't a director, he wasn't an actor, he'd been an agent. And he had worked for an agency called CMA, Creative Management Associates. And he was one of 12 men on my contract who represented me because in the New York branch, they would have about 6 agents, all of whom were qualified to represent you. And then you had another 6 on the West Coast, equally qualified to represent you, and he was one of the 6 on the East Coast. And we all knew David Beagleman. He was a very charming, is the first, middle, and last word for David Beagleman. One of those guys that the English have a wonderful expression that I didn't used to know what it meant. My grandmother would say it once in a while, but now I think I know what it means. The expression is too clever by half. When you see someone is just too smooth, too clever by half. Or as somebody said to me, Cliff, have you ever met a con man you didn't like? So people who are practiced at deception, they become experts at the human psychology, how it works. And David Beagleman was a charming, as it turned out, thief and imposter. He had posed, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, when Mr. Kahaner said, well, or when we heard Miss Fitzsimmons say that it was made up to David Beagleman for $10,000, we hung up, and David said, what are you going to do? I said, I better get a lawyer, but I don't think it'll be a Hollywood lawyer. I think I should get somebody outside that environment because it might be a little discomforting for some of the Beverly Hills lawyers to attack at such a high level. Attack is not the right word, confront. And so I said, yeah. So I had known a man named Charles Beardsley. He had a law firm, Beardsley, Hufstetler, and Kimball. He'd passed away, but he was almost like a father to me, a wonderful man. So I called his partner, Seth Hufstetler, equally high character, former head of the California Bar. I called him on the phone, told him the story. He said, get down here right away. I explained to him we'd just come in, Heather and I, from New York, and we were tired. He said, now. So Heather and I schlepped down to L.A., down to Los Angeles, to his office. He said, where are you staying? And I said, I gave him the name of the hotel. And he said, no, you're not. I said, yeah, we have a reservation. He said, no, you're not staying at any hotel. Now, you have to understand Seth Hufstetler. He's a brilliant lawyer. He's also a man of sort of flat gray eyes. He never shows a great deal of emotion. He's not cold. He doesn't express himself. He just sort of says things flat. And when he said, you're not staying in any hotel, the hairs in the back of my neck started to move a little bit. I said, what are you saying, Seth? Oh, he said, it's very unlikely, but he said there exists a remote possibility that maybe there might be a certain individual in Hollywood who would not be too unhappy if they heard something happen to you in the very near future, because you represent a smoking gun. And he said, so therefore I don't want you to stay in any hotel. I found myself, I said, well, and I remembered when I was out doing the picture with Jason TV show, I used to take my daughter to Disneyland with another little girl named Kathy. And I remembered her dad was a nice man, her mother, and they had these 4 kids. And when Seth said, and I don't want you staying with anyone in the business, I want you for the next 30 some odd hours, dummy up. Don't say a word. Keep out of sight. Don't let anybody know where you are. Well, when I called my friend, the father of this little girl, who was a pal of my little 8-year-old, I had to lie to him. And I said, Heather and I are here. We're on the way to New Zealand. Can't get a hotel room. He said, in all of L.A.? I said, yeah. He said, boy, there must be a lot of conventions going on. He didn't pursue it any further. He said, well, sure, I'll move the kids around, and you and Heather can come on over here. We have a pretty big house. He was not in the business, by the way. So, because Mr. Hufstetler made a point, he said, I don't want you staying with anybody in the business. I want you to keep absolutely quiet about this until you are out of here on the way to New Zealand. Because, as I said before, he was afraid that the remote possibility something might happen to me, because at that point I represented, obviously, a smoking gun. So Heather and I went over there, and the rest of the time she kept saying, Daddy, don't you have to go to work? Because she's used to me working. And I had to say, no, I don't have to go to work. And finally we're on a New Zealand flight. Air New Zealand, we got to altitude, and I ordered a bottle of champagne. Actually, they gave it to me, but I welcomed it. And Heather said, Daddy, you don't drink that much. I said, honey, there's a time in every man's life when maybe he drinks a little bit. I didn't tell her what happened. But I had been assured by Mr. Hufstetler, my attorney in L.A., that he said, I will get this to the district attorney immediately. And when you come back in a couple of weeks, it should be a fait accompli. Well, that's what we thought. That's what he thought. And that's what one would think. But never underestimate the Byzantine movements of politics and movies and crime. Ed and I went down and we helped them raise a lot of money for their mental health program, and we were very pleased about that. And we got back, and I called Seth, And he said, "Where are you?" I said, "I just landed in LAX. We're back." He said, "Get out of town." I said, "No, no, you understand, Seth. You said you're getting at the district attorney and I'll be taking it. Get out of town." I said, "You're not kidding me." He said, "No, I don't want you anywhere where anybody in this town knows where you are. You can tell your wife who's back in New York, but keep it very, very low profile." So I went back. I'm a pilot and have been for many years. And I went back to a pilot buddy of mine. He and his wife lived back in Illinois. So I didn't tell him that we were hiding, but they had been asking us to come out there for a long time. So I decided that would be a perfect time. So we went back, and I waited for the phone call from Seth Hofstadter because he said, "We're still looking into everything." So he called 2 weeks later, and I said, "What's the story?" He said, "I just found out that," surprise, surprise, "the Burbank police, the Hollywood police, the Beverly Hills police, surprise, surprise, wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole." I said, "Wait a minute, Seth, wouldn't touch it. This is not a presumption or an assumption. You said yourself, this is smoking gun. We have the evidence of the check. We have the evidence who it was for. What's going on?" I said, "What does the district attorney say?" He said, "I'll call you in a week." He did. A week later, he called. I asked him a question. "What about the district attorney said?" And then the word that was just as scary as the first time the hairs on my neck went up. "Here is a former head of the California bar, a man of great integrity, influence, knowledge, know-how, not a youngster on the block." And I said, "What about the district attorney, Seth?" And he said, "Nada." I said, "Whoops. You tell me, Seth, you're the former head of the California bar. You tell me what a citizen does in this good democracy of ours. Why is a victim, in this case me, find himself running away from the bad guys or guy? Why does the victim have to run away from the perpetrator of the crime?" He said, "I don't know." I hung up and I thought long and hard about it, and I said, "This is time for me to contact somebody of Lincoln-esque integrity, and in this case, profile." I called Washington, D.C., my good friend, Congressman Udall from Arizona, a man of Lincoln-esque integrity. Very wise, probably the most beloved man on either side of the aisle. He happened to be a Democrat or Republican, a man everybody had the highest esteem for. Now, sadly, he's in the hospital has been for about 6 years with Parkinson's. I just saw him last week. Can't talk anymore, but anyway, that's another story. Sweet man. I called Mo, told him the story. He said, "Get in touch with the FBI immediately." We did. They said, "Get down here immediately." I went to Washington. 2 of their operatives met me at the airport, took me up to the big offices. We told them the story, and they said, "Where are you going now?" I said, "Well, I'm supposed to do a picture in London in 2 days." They said, "We'll be in touch with you." And they were. I went to England. I was told not to say a word, one word, because none of this had come out in the paper. So I went to England, and it was arranged for me my driver drove a Citroen. It was arranged, they have these seats on the passenger side that recline, and it was arranged to take different routes to work. It was explained to me that if some bad guy wants a hit on you, somebody's paid him $50,000 or whatever they pay. Whether he's seen you or not, it's easy if he's a professional to figure out where you are and which way to work and do his job. Usually it's an individual who's never met you or has no reason to shoot you, kill you, other than the fact that a hit's been put on you. And as my accountant said, Cliff, when we first found out about the check, he said, you know, the Beagleman has got a few clouds over him. And I said, well, we've always thought of him as very slick. Oh, well, he said he's a heavy gambler and has been for many years. And he's not unacquainted with individuals in Vegas who are not unacquainted with individuals in Chicago, Detroit, wherever. And he said, the modus operandi, as far as getting a hit on an individual, is, I guess, he didn't know for sure, but he had a good idea, is somebody calls somebody who calls somebody else who calls somebody else, and about 5 phone calls later, a contract is out to get the individual. So there was concern that maybe a contract had been sent on over to England for one of the boys to pop Cliff off on the way to work in and out of the studio. So it was arranged for me to go in a secret way. And that was all very mysterious. I wasn't allowed to say a word. The FBI said not one word. Well, of course, my wife knew about it. She was back in New York. And about 2 weeks later, she called up and said, let me read you the headlines of Variety or the Daily Report, I forget which one. David Beagleman resigns as president of Columbia Pictures pending an investigation for financial irregularities. She read that to me, and I thought, well, that's it. And now that is a fait accompli. Wrong. A producer I knew who I had worked for, very nice man, happened to be in England at the time, came to visit studios that week. And at lunch, everybody was talking about Beagleman resigning and financial irregularities. I'm sitting there, not one word. My ears are 4 foot wide. I'm listening. And they're all talking about it, and I'm just listening. And this fellow said, well, you know, this whole thing's a farce. And somebody said, why? And he said, well, he said, I guarantee you, he says, the way they operate out there, he said, this guy Beagleman will be back in with full powers in 6 weeks. They'll do a high PR campaign. They'll make it look like an oversight or aberration, a temporary aberration, or some little mistake. And he was wrong. 4 weeks, he was back in. And I subsequently found out they contacted they referred to a psychologist to the stars. He was a very prominent man. Obviously he got very prominent salary for his job. And he'd come over to the studio and they made a point evidently walking down the corridors talking, as if he's consulting this poor sick man who had this temporary aberration, which at first blush would seem that way. It wasn't quite that way. It went back since he was very young. The man was a through and through crook. Had some distinct character flaws. We all do, but these were rather heavy. He had been an agent for a number of years, but then it came out, well, I'm ahead of myself. Anyway, oh dear. So he was back in. And I remember thinking, boy, this is tough. What do we do now? Meanwhile, I finished the picture. I came on back. And my wife and I were talking about it. And I was just sickened by the specter of corruption. And there's all kinds of, little vague things being said about Beagleman. And being an ex-reporter, I guess once in a while we kind of go back to what we once started. I was talking one night to my wife at the time. We were married 22 years. She's an actress. We're no longer married. Fine person. She said, what are you toying with? Are you toying with being a Don Quixote and confronting this whole thing. I said, yeah, I am. I think it's terrible. This whole thing is being paved over, and it's wrong. And so I talked to Kay Graham, Washington Post. And she, of course, was, by that time there was leaks out about Hollywood and all of some of its corruptive influences. So she said, would you cooperate? I said, all the way. Whatever needs to be done. She said, thank you. So I subsequently was interviewed by various people. Now, the interesting thing was, when it came out on Christmas Day, I was up in the mountains and I got a call from a top producer. I won't mention his name. And he was, of course, very irate. Well, naturally, he had every reason to be. His kingdom was being, if not threatened, certainly there was some damage there, possible damage. And then when it went into the LA Times, as it was reported later, the article was minimized. Somebody said the whole story was gutted, we say in journalistic parlance. It was gutted. They took all the guts out of it. And even a very top motion picture critic kind of dismissed it. He didn't know at the time, not to paint him with a bad brush. But the point of it was there were influences that either refused to or were being told to minimize it, cool it. Well, Leo Jaffe, one of the top men at Columbia for many years, just left us, passed away here last year. A man of high integrity, his son's equally so, one of whom I worked for. Terrific producer. I had seen him at a function, a charity function, and he said, en passant, he said, Cliff, we're looking into this thing. Obviously, he didn't know all the answers, but he was trying to assure me that they, Columbia Pictures. Well, it might be a good point here to go back to that rather swift, almost mysterious promotion of Mr. Beagleman as president of Columbia Pictures without a background that would be normally identified with such a high posture. He had been an agent. He had told and posed to everyone that he had gone to Yale Law School and had been a lawyer. In the subsequent Hollywoodgate scandal that began to come out on the front pages of Newsweek and Stories in Time and everything else, a very intrepid young lady for, I think it was California West or Hollywood West magazine, she took the trouble, as my old former city editor used to say, do your homework, dig in, get the background. She took the trouble, she called New Haven, and they said, David who? Turned out he had not only never been a lawyer, he had never been to Yale. He was a young man who was in a hurry, went to DeWitt Clinton High School. There were a few clouds even then, some of which came to me. I get every David Beagleman story around. There's no point in even repeating them. He had been an agent, and there had been clouds. I guess it's probably one of the first times, as long as they're in my guild, I'll tell it. I've never mentioned this, I don't think. One of the things that had happened while he was an agent, he'd stolen a watch from Tiffany's. And evidently, the late Sonny Werblin, I guess, was a big mover in the sports circle in those days, evidently got him off. And I talked to police people, and they said, oh, Beagleman, yeah. I even, after this erupted, I'd get calls from people who worked in the agency, including one fellow, and I won't say his name, can't even remember it, but he remembered going over to David, I might add, after the war, had sold encyclopedias for a short time. Then he got a job in an insurance company and was evidently fired under a cloud of stealing. This is in the 40s, after World War II. He then married a girl whose father was an agent and became an agent. And he subsequently divorced that girl, and he was married several times after that. He was a fast mover, charming, really charming. Abe Schneider, another honorable former head of Columbia Pictures, this is after Cohn had died, whose son was made president. He was the chairman of the board. Two honest men, hardworking, capable men. At some point, a group of individuals, and I'm not going to go, and you can look it up and find out who they are because they're pretty prominent people and they're powerful, evidently decided to make a move on Columbia, and they were in a position to. And as I heard from one of the writers for a New York Times article, the master plan was to ultimately puff the stock up and then sell it and make a lot of money. This was written in a New York Times article by Lucian Truscott, good writer. Some of it was hotly denied, contested. If you want to look it up, you can. That's not my area. But at any rate, Lucian Truscott told me a story on the phone in the middle of all this. And he said, they're not going back far enough. I said, what? He said, this whole Hollywood Gate thing. They don't go back far enough. I said, what do you mean? He said, they don't go back to Cuba. I said, why do you want to go back to Cuba? He said, well, the reason you should go back to Cuba was when Castro took over Cuba, one of the first things he did was kick out the gambling. The head of gambling in those days was a charmer named Meyer Lansky. Powerful. A man who was arrested, I heard, scores of times and evidently never served a day in jail. So, a pretty smart guy. He had been a major mover in organized crime. And when he was, or his people, were kicked out of Cuba, the gambling, they set up another Bahama gambling syndicate. And there, amongst their partners were Carol Rosenblum, former owner of LA Rams. Can't think of all that. Ray Stark, Charly Allen, a couple of other characters, a Canadian guy. They were all partners in this Bahama gambling syndicate. And at that time, evidently, Ray Stark and Charly Allen, I guess that was the first time they had met. Ray Stark originally was from New Jersey. Charly Allen, the Allen brothers had a big investment firm, very powerful, and it started up in the 20s, but they had a few clouds of their own, but I don't want to get into that. This was evidently one of those moves to take over Columbia. And the plan, as it was told to me by Lucian, was that they saw that with Encounters of a Third Kind upcoming, there would be a ideal time to sell Columbia and make a pretty big profit. And Lucian told this to me on the phone. He said, so when you blew the whistle, if you want to put it that way, that kind of, their deck of cards began to fold. And he said, therefore, you haven't won any popularity contests. These are powerful people. I said, I just did what I know was right. He said, right. So, any rate, they hired David Begelman, who was one of the agents at CMA, to become their president. Well, I'm stupid about how these things work, but I've been told by pretty knowledgeable people that, well, one of the ways that I guess some of organized crime works is if they have a business, they give a name to somebody else as a possessor, but it's just a name. Barbara Walters' father was Lou Walters. He used to be the Lou Walters nightclub back in New York. That was what it was called, one of those nightclubs. And then I think later on in Florida, Lou Walters didn't own it. He was the front man. And I guess perfectly legitimate. Well, I guess David Begelman was put in there as a very utilitarian president, a man who would, I suppose, be cooperative. And I'm not saying crooked necessarily, but what I am saying is that he was a man without the portfolio one would expect of a major motion picture company. He did not have those credentials as a writer, as a director, even producer. He certainly had been an agent, and he certainly had clouds. I heard all kinds of stories about how he evidently ripped off Judy Garland, and he had a romantic relationship with her, but in the process ripped her off of a lot of money. I hear a lot of these things, and I'm not going to go into the sordid details. It begins to sound like a tabloid thing, but it is a dirty, dirty, dirty side of our business. Anyway, he was the president of Columbia Pictures, and during that time, he evidently had his own little game that he was playing, and I'm not sure that his bosses, the heads, even cared, because compared to what they were trying to do, they were pumping up the stock. I'm not sure that they cared. They probably figured he had his own little, what do they call the term when they have their own little
Sidebar almost.
yeah, well, it's their own little cash box. I don't know what it is. Anyway, Begelman was evidently writing checks, having checks made out to him from people, whether they're actors or even directors. Marty Ritt was one, and other people. And the theory or the scenario was that he had given them money, had paid them money, and they were paying him back. And that raised an interesting specter. When I heard about Marty Ritt, as well as Pierre Groulou, I think a PR man at one of the big restaurants where Begelman used to go, everybody, hey, Dave. And he would usually pick up the check, which, you know, it's just characteristic of a con man. I mean, they pick up the check, but they're paying it with somebody else's money. But anyway, I call Marty, because I had known Marty, never worked with him. But when I first came to New York, we would work in little TV things. And right there on the edge of that whole MacArthur mess, McCarthy mess, Joseph McCarthy, that whole thing of the red baiting and that terrible period, I remember on a couple of occasions doing everything I could to try to get these guys work, and Marty was one of them, as an actor, or Marty was a director. Of course, he was a very good, he played the races, and he did pretty well. I remember seeing him in restaurants at night, handicapping in races. And I called Marty to kind of commiserate with him, in effect saying, you know, what's the story here? And he never returned my phone call. I thought, well, gee, maybe he didn't get the message. Call him again. He was at Columbia, of course, had an office there. Never returned my phone call. So I told my secretary, Evelyn Crystal, the one who brought me the check way back at the beginning of this story, I said, go over to his office and see that something's wrong. Maybe he's not getting the message. And she went over and she said she sat there for a long time. She was not. Finally, they said, oh, he's busy. And he never talked to her. So poor Evelyn, I sent her back again later. They kicked her out of the office. Well, it turns out Marty has racehorses, and Marty was a good buddy of Begelman and probably didn't want to get involved in this whole thing. But I've always thought it was a kind of an ironic thing, because he did a very fine movie about blacklisting and about unions, Sally Field. And so here was a man doing movies about important issues, but a little bit reluctant to maybe go all the way. He probably had rational reasons. And I found this in our business awful lot during that whole period. A lot of people I knew, big names. Cliff, hang in there, buddy. Somebody finally got a handle on this corruption. By God, it's finally happened after all these years. Hang in there. Oh, by the way, don't mention my name. And I understood that. I never criticized. I would never tell you who they were because they were people genuinely concerned. And that's why that article I wrote in the New York Times was titled "A Firmament of Fear." Because for some 70, 80 years in our business, that unwritten commandment, thou shalt never confront a mogul on major corruption or thou shalt not work. You create a fear, whether it's an industry or a government or a society or a country. You create fear, or on the block. Bully on the block creates fear, controls the block. Create fear so that people, Saddam Hussein, I cannot believe that all those poor Iraqi people love and admire that man. I think all of them are afraid of that man. And I think most of those people in Germany, or not most of them, but a lot of them, were afraid of that man, Hitler. And nobody was around, or at least for whatever reasons they had, nobody confronted it. So when you create a firmament of fear, you create control. And a lot of good people are affected by that. Why? Because their livelihoods are involved. It's easy to me to get up here, and not easy, but I mean, somebody get up and preach about it. But the little guy says, hey man, I can't take that stand. I got to pay for the kids to get them into school. I can't take, that's dangerous. Well, that's the danger in a democracy or in an industry or in a business or certainly in an art form. When you have people who are otherwise good people who are reluctant to speak out. And if they're in an environment of fear, good reason. My grandmother made me learn a little poem, which I've subsequently forgot, but I remember the basic line was, I think it was Ella Wheeler Wilcox. It was one of those kind of Edgar Guest corny little things, but it was meaningful. And it was entitled, Speak Up and Express Yourself. And the bottom line of the philosophy was, whether you agree or disagree, don't sit there, suck your thumb idly or shrug your shoulders. Speak up and express yourself. And this is what I'm talking about in our union. Those brave people in the 30s, and these were stars. We're talking about Jimmy Cagney and Ralph Bellamy and Montgomery, Robert Montgomery, a lot of these people, Eddie Cantor, all those people, Paul Muni, these were stars. And they were jeopardizing their career in many ways by standing up to these tough characters who were some of these moguls. So end of my lecture about that. Getting back to the story. So anyway, Bigelman was now being exposed. And a lot of people felt, well, he'll go to jail. And meanwhile, they mentioned my name, and of course, and I noticed right around then I wasn't getting any phone calls. I didn't really, phone calls for work. And I'm not saying that they all got together up in a motel. It's not like the mafia back getting in a motel and saying we're going to go do a number. This is, the FBI explained to me, these were a few individuals who are brighter than that. They're very bright. They're people, and I'm not saying it's an organized thing, but a few individuals got together and said, we must not let this be a precedent for other writer, director, actors, or even producers to confront our domain, our fiefdom. We must hang tough. One of the ways to hang tough, make sure Cliff doesn't work. There are all kinds of ways to do that. Just raise an eyebrow now and then in a casting moment. I've seen that happen. Somebody go, oh, really? They don't have to say anything. The word trickles down. One of the favorite words that sometimes people use in our business is difficult. And God love him, Henry Fonda, with whom I had the great joy of working with several times, as well as his daughter, said to me one day, Cliff, don't ever in this town worry about the word that they use. I said, what word? He said, the word difficult. I said, well, what do you mean? You shouldn't get pompous. No, no, he said, I'm not talking about that. He said, an awful lot of people in this industry will use the word difficult at you or me or somebody else. And the reason it's not that you're difficult, it's that maybe, just possibly, your standards are a little too high or maybe higher than theirs. And they can't relate to that or they don't want to. And therefore, you are difficult. And suddenly, you're difficult, meaning a lot of people say difficult. Well, that means the actor is throwing tantrums and asking for all kinds of outrageous goodies or perks or being difficult or being late to work or not learning their lines or not doing their jobs. And it ain't necessarily so. Now, getting back to the Bigelow thing, I keep straying. I forgot. Now it's in international. I'm hearing from people in England and everything else, all about Hollywood Gate. And I'm not working. But that's all right. We're hanging in. And then he was subsequently indicted and convicted. And a friend of mine, lawyer, told me, I'll tell you what's going to happen. There'll be a court date, and there'll be a change, whatever they call it, change of venue, whatever it is. It'll happen at the 11th hour, and it'll go to another judge. And then you'll see some interesting things being done. Well, he had the firm of that guy Bouncer and all Wyman, these powerful law firm guys that Boucher's long dead, but these guys go back to the old 30s film. Wyman, no, later. He joined, I think, Bouncer later. But these are powerful law firms, and hey, they have them in Washington too. Powerful law firms do powerful things. Guess what? There was a change of venue or whatever you call it. And all of a sudden he was facing a judge in either Burbank or somewhere around there. I forgot his name. I forgot the guy's some Irish name. I can't remember it. I don't want to remember. Anyway, as somebody said later, he wasn't, they didn't slap his wrist. They massaged it because they found he was guilty. They made it almost negligible. And the deal was, I guess Mr. Wyman or his lawyer said, Mr. Bigelow is concerned about the drug problems and he will make a movie about the danger of angel dust, I think. That was a terrible drug that was permeating on the streets. Well, maybe Mr. Bigelman's concerned about drugs, or maybe Mr. Wyman was just concerned about getting Mr. Bigelman off that docket. But anyway, he got off. I was told later that he made a phone call to two young filmmakers. These guys always know. I guess they were back at the studio. And two young filmmakers made a very effective little $30,000 or $35,000 little documentary on the dangers of angel dust, and I heard it was very effective. I also heard from some of my friends at the studio that when it was shown, Bigelman was there, and some of the other cast of characters that I've just mentioned. And they all sat there, including, I was told, I have no way of verifying this, I don't want to. I was also told the judge was there. And I was told that champagne was there. And I was told at the end of the picture, there was a hefty toast. And so Mr. Bigelman was free, clear, and it was treated, as I say, even the local press kind of minimized the whole thing. But now people are beginning to get to it. The union was getting to it. And I did give a talk at the board, at the New York meeting, which was subsequently printed in the op-ed in the New York Times. That would have been 1980, I guess. And then I gave another speech, basically the same speech to New York, or rather to the LA board at the annual meeting. Now people said, did it have any effect? Interesting. We ran a little bit of a check, kind of cursory, but no reason to deny this, to see if in that period of exposure at Watergate, did it have an effect on creative bookkeeping? In other words, another of the warts of our business, cheating writers, cheating directors, cheating actors, even cheating producers in creative bookkeeping. Another fiddling with the numbers. We know all about that as actors. And whether our residuals, they're better now than they were, but anyway. And we came to this interesting, and you can check it out. I may be dead wrong, but I don't think so. I have a pretty good memory on this fact. I wanted to see if in that first, 8, 9, 10 months of Hollywoodgate, if it had trickled down to the creative bookkeepers, in other words, to the guys who were doing all these tricky things with the books, and had it had an effect. We came up with this startling, and it sounds just too to be true, but evidently is, that in that first year, without any appreciable increase in employment, and in that first year, without any appreciable new gains by our union, but some, there was an increase in the residuals after that first year of exposure to Hollywoodgate. Normally, if a man or a woman have a company and they have, let's say, when I ask this question to somebody who's in the business, I'll say, well, if your income increased a certain percentage rather dramatically, would you raise an eyebrow? And they say, yes, if it's appreciable. And I always say, well, what would be an appreciable amount unless it was a bonanza? You had a huge, big inventory and you sold it all. Well, they said if things were normal one year and the next year they were normal, but we suddenly saw an increase in profits or whatever of 10 or 15 or 20%, we'd kind of say, hey, where'd that come from? You're not going to believe this number. I couldn't believe it when it came up because we checked. That first year of Hollywoodgate, the residuals to the members of Screen Actors increased over 800%. That was not because of any great increase in the work. There was some, or any other kind of legitimate reason. Obviously, it had forced some of these people looking at these ledgers to clean up their act, if only for a short time. Now, I'm not saying that it's cleaned the business or anything, but it had a profound impact that first year. It's never been printed. Interesting. Anyway, Begelman was out, and then, surprise, surprise, he was back still at the big restaurants. At this one, Mame's own restaurant, he came in, and obviously a PR person had rigged this whole thing up. His old cronies were there, and they applauded when he came in. Well, normally you'd say, well, that shows a kind of a wonderful Confederate fellowship. They were saying, hey, hang in there, you've had a rough patch. No, afraid not. It was simply, again, toadying up to power. So whether it's a guy who, because of his relationship, like Marty Ritt, finds it awkward, embarrassing, or whether it's these other people who find themselves saluting people only because people they're saluting have the money, people who are arresting their basic instincts of what's good or what's wrong, conforming to this sycophantic cancer. Anyway, get back to the story, Robertson. So Begelman was out, and guess what? Begelman was then made president of MGM-UA. Well, some people would say, well, wait a minute, with that background, why? Well, I'm naive. That's what I would ask. And I've been told by people far busier, smarter than I am, and very busy in this whole network. A lot of these guys go way back. Maybe it's they go back to the poker table that they play every week, or they go back to New York, or go back to when they knew each other in school. A lot of these guys who were playing these games have a kind of a honor among thieves, if you will. Also, they know that the other guy knows where some of the bodies are buried. So if you've got enough evidence on certain people, they'll cooperate. So maybe Beagleman was able to use his charm, and maybe he was able to kind of tap in. Whatever the reasons was, he was hired. I don't know, but he was hired. But then after, and my memory's a little faulty, but I remember the Variety, I believe it was, reported at one point after I don't know how many pictures. I think one or two made money under his aegis, but they were something like 600 million in debt. Now this has got to make the banks who are putting the money up on and say, wait a minute, you hired a guy who had been convicted, indicted and convicted, and you hired him to be your, well, anyway, long story short, he was, I was pretty much the end of his tenure, I guess, after 10 or 11 movies. And he is a survivor, evidently an individual from a company there that was using facilities in the MGM lot. I want to say Greenwood or Greenbrier or Green something. I can't think of the name. It was a little, and I'm not sure but what a man named Hunt was involved with this. I don't know. But anyway, it was explained to me that individuals went to him when he knew he had just a few weeks left. And he said to this company, look, I'm still in the position of power as far as distribution. Play ball with me. And they said, what's that? I said, well, if I leave here, then he knew he was going to. I want to be your president. So shortly thereafter, he left. He became the head of this little company. He was made president of the company, and that company didn't exactly succeed. It succeeded in getting into a lot of trouble. I'm not sure the fellow's name, but I think one of the guys ended up in the pokey. I'm not sure. But I do know that his fortunes were running lean, I guess. He was still gambling from all indications. And we're dealing with a human being. I keep try to remind myself, this guy is not immune to pain. I'm sure he had some very painful, I'm not sure he had some, I would think normally, but something about the persistence of a corruptible person. I think there's a rationale there. They may be stealing from the little guy, whether it's a little actor or whether it's a widow or whether it's like this guy Keating down in Arizona. These guys are all charming, but they steal and they hurt people. It's not just a matter of manipulating monies in an impersonal way and making a lot of money illegally. It's a matter of stealing money from people, and many times little people. So that our union was hurt, quite obviously. And that came to my attention not too long ago when Mr. Beagleman, I guess, was making furtive phone calls for a deal. And he checked into the Century West, I guess it's called, out there in Century City. And he made a few more phone calls from a suite. He didn't go home. He was married several times. And I must say, I feel terribly, you can't help but feel great sorrow, pity for people, not only people he stole from, but people who he lived with, or his wives, or any children involved, stepchildren or whatever. These people had to be hurt. And you can't help but feel for that. But at the same time, he was a man who was hurting people. And did it scot-free for many, many years. So we can't forget that. So when he checked into the Century West, he used it, from what I read in the New York Times, he used a fictitious name. He went up, made a few phone calls. He had, I guess, lunch that day and was trying to make some of these fast deals and had failed. And we assumed this is what happened. Nothing. He had a gun, and he ordered some champagne and very quickly ended his life at the age of 74 and having lived a rather rich life off of an awful lot of people. We assume he did it himself. There's been all kinds of scenarios that if you're dealing with gamblers and you would do something bad to the boys, you might get a visit and somebody might say, pick up a pen and write some suicide notes. And they might have a silencer and they might put you away. I mean, that's just one bizarre possibility. Or he might have just gotten drunk and boom. But obviously he didn't suffer. He went out quickly. But he made a lot of other people suffer. Now it came out later, and this is where the Guild's involved. And I wanted to check with the Guild about this because it was printed that when he did away with himself, and that again, some of that was kind of softened. One very fine writer, columnist in Hollywood, nice guy, good reputation. Well, he almost wrote an homage to him. Well, of course, he'd had a lot of lunches been paid for, and I think he thought that he was just a kind of a little bit naughty. But the truth of it, he was a bad person, and he hurt a lot of people. So anyway, then it came out, and I read this in the paper. So I haven't had a chance to, haven't looked into it, but I have no doubts it's true. That when he finally checked out, he owed an individual, I think his name was Kimmel, a man in the manufacturing business or clothing business in New York. The thing I read said that he owed him $3 million. A lot of money. But, and here's where the union comes in, it indicated that he had owed, non-paid, over $4 million to actors' residuals. This is where we're involved. I haven't talked to anybody in the union about it, but I had meant to, so this is a good time to raise the question. Not that we can do anything about it. You might say that's under the bridge, but I think we want to remember. We want to remember that there are skullduggery, there is skullduggery, there are scoundrels. There are also just temporarily naughty boys or girls who think they can get away with something for a while and then patch it up later. But this was a man who, for the most part of his life, was lying and stealing and doing bad things and hurting people. So enough of Mr. Beagleman. I think, in a way, that old poet, more to be pitied than, what is it? More to be pitied than...
More to be pitied than envied.
More to be pitied than envied. Thank you. More to be... Oh, that was the thing about she was only a lassie who ventured into life's stormy path, ill-advised. Well, that's a kind of a sweet but maybe more to be pitied in a way, except that he hurt a lot of people. And we mustn't let this kind of character hurt so many of our people. And we must have the courage when it happens, no matter how charming they are, no matter how many sycophants they have around them, no matter how many expensive PR people they have to try to kind of diminish the crime or pull it under the rug, no matter how many times a newspaper guts a story, well-intentioned but wrong. We must tell the truth, and we must confront the truth, and we must recognize that these individuals still exist. I mean, there are a lot of very fine people in our industry, and fine people, some very creative and very good. One of the tragedies is so many of them are not working, and that's not good. But there we are. We're in a business where there are far too many actors for the number of jobs available. But as somebody said, nobody asked you into the business, you went in voluntarily.
Cliff, let me ask you, because this is such an important historical document, can you give me a very short, concise version on the end of David Beagleman? Just maybe even starting out, the end of David Beagleman, bam. So like he left, he was fired out of Columbia, he worked for a while, and ultimately he committed suicide under a cloud of scandal, whatever. But just a quick version, just in case, the power of the story is your experience, but we might need the last chapter on Beagleman, short and sweet.
Well, I would not give you a short and sweet ending on a very long and mean individual. Too many people were hurt. I won't make it short and sweet. I'll try to shorten it, But you mustn't ride over the realities, the tough realities that this individual, and there are other individuals like him, hurt people. And some of these people are innocent. Some of them are old widows, whether they're Keating or this guy, that crook down in Arizona, or whoever these guys are, and maybe some women too. They hurt people. They steal from people. And a lot of these people they have no defenses. Now, when Mr. Beagleman killed himself, we don't know. But when he did, it was out quick. He had some champagne, and he was 74 years old, and he'd gotten away with murder almost for an awful long time, hurt a lot of people. And he went out quickly. And whether he did it or somebody else said, hey, write this note, and put the gun to him because he owed so much money. We know this, and I read this, and you mustn't leave this out of this interview. I read this, and you can corroborate it, that when he died, he owed a man named Kimmel $3 million. That was his latest, a man in the manufacturing or clothing business in New York. $3 million, and this is the part that's relevant, you mustn't take this out, he owed over $4 million in actors' residuals that he had stolen, misappropriated, call it what you want, that we didn't get. Our people didn't get it. He had hurt us financially, but also he had hurt an awful lot of other people in the business. And I feel great, great sorrow for those who were related to him, marriages, stepchildren, whatever. I'm not insensitive to their pain, but I cannot overlook the pain that he put upon for so many years the people within our industry. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Again, pulling a long bow, going way back. I started as a journalist. I never intended to be an actor. Fell in with bad companions, ended up off Broadway, then on Broadway, ultimately doing plays, television shows, ultimately movies. I did not embrace that town. I mean, I didn't dislike it, but I never felt that comfortable with it. I always kind of felt it was a lot of glitz, a lot of swiftness, but a lot of fine people too, and a lot of talent. But it was not my town. My hometown was La Jolla, which is 100 miles south. But when I was a boy with 4,000 people, it was like 1,000 miles away from Hollywood. Didn't in any way reflect the town of Hollywood. But anyway, I worked for a paper, and as I say, ended up on working in the theater and then in television. Went out, did my first movie called Picnic, said the words, picked up the check, met Bill Holden. We became fast friends for the rest of his life. And the other people, Roz Russell, wonderful. Betty Fields, good, fine, wonderful performers. Anyway, I came back to New York and got a call not long after, said, well, we want you to come out and test for another movie. And I said, well, send me the script. They said, no, we want you to come out and test for the movie. I said, well, why can't I read the script? They said, read page 64, chapter 13A. On your contract, it says that within a certain time frame, we at Columbia can have you come back and do another movie and test for a movie. So I called my agent, my dear Jane Broder at the time in New York, and she said, well, I guess you got to go. So I went out and tested for a movie with Joan Crawford. Now, Joan Crawford, I'm writing a book now. I have a chapter about Joan Crawford. A book should be written, but she was a remarkable actress. But to me, in my memory, as a little kid going to the Granada Theater in La Jolla, California, she was the quintessential evil, wicked woman. I mean, this woman on screen seduced Clark Gable and Walter Houston. I mean, you could seduce a man of the cloth in Rain like Walter Houston. That was wicked and forbidding. So suddenly I recognized that I am going to have love scenes, because it was a May-December story, a story of an older woman falls in love with a young GI, with Joan Crawford. So I did it, and she was very nice to me, and her late husband, Al Steele, couldn't have been nicer. Shortly thereafter, I was asked to do another film, and I read it, and I didn't think it was very good, and so I said I didn't think I wanted to do it. I was called into Mr. Cohn, And he was like the Wizard of Oz. I can still see that bald head sitting there with all those Emmys, not Emmys, Oscars that his company had won, Columbia Pictures. And he said in that gruff voice, "Hey, kid, why don't you want to do this picture? Sit down." So I came and sat down. I said, "Because I don't think it's, pardon me, I don't think it's very good." "Yeah? What's wrong with it?" "Well, should we start at page 1? He looked at the woman sitting there next to him. He says, "Give me that script." Give him a script. "All right." He said, "I'm a man. I want specifics." Page 1. He flicked it. I looked at it. I started. Got to page 3. He said, "All right, that's enough. You're going to do the goddamn picture." I said, "I don't think so." He said, "I know so." "I don't think so, Mr. Cole." And I got up and I got to the door. I'll never forget it. And he yelled at me, "Kid!" I turned around. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You got more guts than you got brains." And I said, "You're right." And he was right. But I didn't do the picture.
I love that story. Now, you had a comment too about the moguls of that time versus today's heads of studios, which I thought was a very interesting.
Well, I'm not a great uh, historian of motion pictures or Hollywood or anything like that. I have done, just finished my 50th movie, so I've done a lot I'd like to forget. But anyway, I've done a lot of movies, and I've been grateful. And with the exception of when I was suddenly out of work during the Hollywood gate for a little over 3 years, worked pretty continually. But there is a difference, obviously. Everything changes. But in those days, as has been often reported, the studios were usually run by one dynamic, powerful mogul. It could have been Harry Cohn, it could be Jack Warner, it could have been Louis B. Mayer, any one of these tough moguls. And it's often said about them, they liked movies. It's also been said that you got an answer, yes or no. Might have been no a lot, but you got a distinct answer. You don't get those clear answers today because you got a corporate group. And they are all very bright, or at least they seem very bright. And a lot of them have law degrees, and a lot of them have fancy degrees from fancy schools. And they're wizards with computers, and they're wizards at a lot of things. One of the things they're wizards at is not being able to give you a definite answer. It's one of those, maybe it's a diplomatic thing. They defer it to somebody else, and pretty soon you get a fuzzy answer indicating, well, we're not sure we want to do this project now or whatever. Well, that's all right. If it means they have to consider their investment, they should. So they shouldn't jump into it impulsively. But that's one of the differences. The other difference that I've noticed, because I've been around the trenches so long, is there are a lot of wunderkinds, guys who were, or gals, very young, which is all right. We want a young, vital attitude. But so often, if they're writers or if they're directors or actors, they haven't had another dimension. They haven't had a life experience. You see some of these young producer or director characters out there, and many of them were brought up there. And their whole frame of reference in life is Beverly Hills or New York. And it's kind of wheeling and dealing, and it's fast, and it's mesmerizing, and it's slick. But it suddenly occurs to you sometimes that it lacks an inner core. You feel, talking to some of these directors, they can recite chapter and verse who directed what film. They're a walking encyclopedia. They've seen an awful lot of film, but they haven't seen much of life. And when you haven't seen much of life, it's got to affect how you look at film. It's got to affect how you talk to an actor if you're a director. It's got to affect how you write if you're a writer. And I deplore that. That seems to be a dimension that's missing, and it's missing because we live in an accelerated age. We're just going so fast. Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Time Must Have a Stop. Never quite knew what it meant, but now I think I know a little bit. We're just going too fast. And if we are purveyors of life on this angst-filled world, if we're making movies, and I consider myself a movie maker, it's good if we have a little more reference as to what it's all about, Alfie. Not just New York, not just Hollywood, but the middle of the country, the southern part of the country, the northern part of the country, Europe, Asia. I think we need a little more dimension. Now, some movies don't need it, but overall, I think we do.
Cliff, you had a wonderful comment about yourself in which you compared yourself to Betty Davis as a survivor. Can you give that do a take two on that like you did?
Well, I would never compare myself in any way to Betty Davis because she is a legend and a great actress, and everybody knows it. But she had a gutsy strength. I would say she was one of the few unafraid. Whatever fear might have been there, she transformed into a kind of a confrontation, challenge. How can you help but admire a woman who had been one of the time at the top of the ratings, what do they call them, as a movie star, taking an ad, full page ad, I understand, in one of the trades saying experienced actress looking for a job. In a way, it's demeaning, maybe you might say, and sad. But I heard that one of the founders, was it Lasky, one of those guys that founded Paramount, did the same thing. Now, I don't think Hollywood is ever in grave danger of becoming the spiritual center of America. But on the other hand, it ain't all bad. There's not a lot of good people here. Some of them have short memories, and their fidelity sometimes is in direct relation to what you can do for me. And if you can't do something for me, ciao, baby, we'll do lunch next year. I see the same thing in Washington, D.C. Morris Udall, a man I mentioned before, a former congressman from Arizona, highly respected, most highly, by both Republicans and Democrats, was struck with Parkinson's here about 7 years ago. And I was one of the first people that knew it. He told me. I used to visit him all the time. He came to my house in Long Island. And he's now in this veterans hospital. He can't speak, but he can speak with his eyes. And I just saw him just last week. I go down when I can. And here's this man, formerly 6'3", now fetal position in this veterans hospital, all alone in this room. He's got things on the wall, a few things that I've written, and he'll kind of point to them, and he'll go, oh, he can't talk. So I just say, well, that's right, I understand. And I will talk about the 76 campaign when he was in the primaries, Democratic primaries. And what a meaningful experience it was to me and our relationship since then. And I look at this man, and I think, and I was thinking of this the other day, I said to the nurse, as I always say, anybody come in to see him? Oh, not many. I say, who was the last one? 2 weeks ago, somebody came in. It's so sad. I mean, people don't like to go see a person who they've loved or known, see them ill, but at the same time, they have feelings, those people. I'll tell you one little story. It's apolitical, but it has to do with the person in the political window. Some years ago, well, I think maybe it was 5 years ago, the First Lady, Barbara Bush, came into that hospital. I was told this by the nurses. Unescorted, no PR, no photo op, nobody, just her on a Mother's Day, and sat next to Mo by his bed and held his hand for an hour. That's a class act. She did it just out of a feeling of compassion for a man who's suffering terribly every waking moment of his life. It's not fair. Where are those people that hovered around Mo when they needed him? Well, they find other reasons. It's a little like the big star who finds other reasons for not getting involved in more of the union activities to try to help our union. It's a little like that. I love you, baby, but the show closed, you know. And some of these people up there in this high troposphere on the top, and got their ranches in Montana and their big Mediterranean palaces, wherever, Pasadena or Santa Barbara or Hollywood Hills or whatever. Come on down, Mr. Movie Star. Come on down. Well, I don't know if I'm a survivor or just refuge. Um, I guess there is kind of a misplaced or maybe fortunate gene or two from my gene pool of ancestors. I know from what I know, they fought in the Civil War and they fought in the Revolutionary War, and evidently they behaved themselves pretty well. So I guess there's a couple of genes in there that just hang in when things get tough. And I've always tried with my two daughters, Stephanie and Heather, to treat every obstacle that comes your way as possibly an opportunity in disguise. Maybe when it seems like something formidable that you can't. Maybe you just wait a minute and assess it, and look at it and say, wait a minute, maybe this is an opportunity, think about it. And it's worked that way in my case many times. Even with the role, sometimes you get a role that, well, you do the role and you think, gosh, I don't know if this is very well written. But sometimes the fact that it's not well written works in your favor. Maybe the director will say to you, well, can we, or maybe the writer will say to you, can we work on this? Hey, I'm ready. I love to work with words. So I would say to my young students, treat every obstacle, what appears to be an obstacle, as an opportunity, laying wait for you to challenge it. Hang in there. Don't give up.